Hello and welcome to the Shane Show. I'm Shane Connick. Today we're going to meet the new director of the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism at the University of Maryland. Before this, he was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, along with being a contributing columnist to the Sports Business Journal and a sports editor at Bloomberg. He has also taught sports management over at the George Washington University Business School, hence experience in both journalism and in business. An alumnus of the University of Pennsylvania and University of Maryland School of Law, Dr. Mark Hyman. Dr. Hyman, it's great to see you. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for inviting me, Shane. I appreciate it. And I am a Terp. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I am an alumnus of the University of Maryland.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on to the show. So you have a Bachelor of Arts actually in history from the University of Pennsylvania before you were a Terp. What were you planning on doing at that point when you were in college studying now history? You eventually would go into becoming a reporter for the Sun much later, but what were you planning on doing at that point?
Yeah, when I was an undergraduate at Penn, it's true that I never took a journalism course. And the reason for that was that Penn had no school of journalism. There was no opportunity to learn about journalism in a classroom at Penn. But I did get, I think, a wonderful grounding in journalism at the student paper at Penn, the Daily Pennsylvanian. So, very much like the Diamondback, a newspaper that was important, that was an important source of news on campus. And a lot of students who were interested in journalism really cut their teeth there. So I would say I spent probably as much time in the offices of the DP as I did in classrooms at Penn. And my experience at the DP really, very much pointed me in the direction of a career in journalism.
And so after your time at Penn, you graduated from Penn in 1978, became a reporter for the Baltimore Sun in 1986. In between that, what kinds of things were you doing?
Yeah, well, I was, my career started out in a very traditional way for a sports journalist of that time. I got a newspaper job in Norfolk, Virginia, the Norfolk Ledger-Star, and, started pretty close to the bottom rung of the ladder, covered some high schools and covered college football and basketball. Norfolk State, historically black college in Norfolk, was one of my early beats. And from there, I moved to the Philadelphia Bulletin, an evening daily in Philadelphia. Then spent some time at the Dallas Times-Herald, another evening newspaper in Dallas, and then to the Baltimore Sun in 1986. But I during that period, I was really getting some really valuable experience covering some big stories. For instance, at the Times-Herald, I was covering Southern Methodist University football at a time when SMU was one of the powerhouses of the country. And during the time I was there, there was an investigation that our newspaper undertook with regard to players at SMU who were being paid by the university to play football. And the reporting that we did, in part, led to the NCAA handing down the death penalty against SMU. So the SMU football team, I believe, was the first school in history that had to stop playing football because of an NCAA sanction. So that was all really good training.
So you had these interests in business and in law, along with in history when you were at Penn, but also it seems like you were always interested in becoming a journalist. Where did that interest in journalism kind of come from?
Shane, I think my story is pretty much like, most young journalists who, have the experience of covering stories, meeting newsmakers, thinking about issues, seeing their name in the newspaper and understanding the impact that their work has, and getting very inspired by that. I mean, I was sports editor of my high school newspaper. I was sports editor of the DP at Penn. So as long as I can remember, I had a deep interest in sports. And when it became clear that I wasn't going to be playing sports beyond high school, I started to pivot and think about, how I could take my real, deep interest in sports and do something with it that would, that could be a career.
So did anything noteworthy happen in your high school sports career?
Well, I played baseball. I was captain of my high school baseball team. So I was president of the varsity club, but I was a 5-foot left-handed first baseman, 5'7" left-handed first baseman. Not a real big demand for 5'7" first baseman. So I played for a short time on the freshman team at Penn, but I was not going to be a college player. That was clear.
And did you go to high school in Maryland?
I didn't. I grew up in New Jersey, in Freehold, New Jersey, famous for being the birthplace of Bruce Springsteen. And I went to high school not far from there at a private school called the Rutgers Preparatory School.
And so now I know, aside from journalism, sports, all that, well, kind of with sports, you're working on a documentary now, The Great China Baseball Hunt. What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. At GW, about 4 years ago, I took a group of graduate students to China for a course on Major League Baseball's efforts to grow MLB's brand in China. And we spent, I think, 8 days in Beijing and Shanghai. And MLB was great. They really allowed us to experience all that they're doing in China to try to grow a sport that is pretty obscure at this point. And one of the things we saw was they refer to them as development centers. And they're essentially schools to which MLB brings young players from around the country. They find talent around the country, bring them to these centers, and try to train them to become major league players. There's never been a big league player from mainland China in baseball history. So, we talked to the players, we observed the training methods, and I was fascinated by this story, which I thought was not widely known. And within a year, with a friend of mine, a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, we were working on a documentary film, and we continue to work on it 4 years later. But in that time, there have been a number of players who are products of this minor league, or rather this development system in China, who have come to the U.S., been signed to professional contracts, and come to the U.S. and played minor league baseball. But still, no player from mainland China has ever played in the big leagues. And that's really the story of our documentary, that quest, that search for the first player.
And so speaking of this business side of sports, you were talking about the way that this is kind of what you were teaching at GW and what you were analyzing with sports. What long-term effects do you think that the pandemic right now could ultimately have on sports?
Yeah, Shane, I think it's an interesting question, and I think the one that's on the minds of anybody who owns a franchise or is involved in professional or college sports. When does this end, and what do sports look like when it ends? And I think one of the fascinating questions in the short term is when are fans going to be able to come back to sports? Number one, when will they be permitted to come back? I think that's the first question. And we're seeing, college football wrestle with that right now. Yesterday, I turned on the news and the governor of the state of Iowa is saying that she was okay with, I think, 25,000 fans going to Iowa State football games. And an hour and a half later, the university announces that there will be no fans at the game, out of concern for the health of fans. So I think we're in a period where we're trying to sort that out. Is there going to be an opportunity for fans to come back before a vaccine? I don't think we know the answer. And even after a vaccine, are people immediately going to feel comfortable returning to sports? And, you know, this is so important to the, leagues and owners of franchises, because revenue from ticket sales and parking and concessions and all of the commerce that goes on in a ballpark or an arena is so important to their bottom line. So in the short term, I think that's the big question. When are fans going to return to the venues, and what do professional teams do, and college teams do to kind of mitigate that? How do they manage the losses in revenue that is a result of the pandemic? Long term, I'm very bullish about sports. I think people are going to return. Long term, I think people will return and sports will be healthy eventually. But I think the big question is, how long is it going to take for us to get back to a world that's semi-normal?
When you think about minor league baseball teams, there are a lot of minor league baseball teams, and none of them are playing in this year. Or maybe some, independent league teams are having truncated seasons and different things, whatever. Either way, they're losing a lot of money. Do you think this is we're going to be seeing? We've already seen it a little bit with the folding of some teams already. Do you think that this is going to be, how detrimental do you think this will be to certain smaller level or even smaller market, bigger teams?
Well, I think we've already seen, some leagues that have just given up. The future, the short-term future was so bleak that they didn't have the resources to continue. I mean, the XFL is an example. The XFL folded, I think, in relatively early in the pandemic. So I think you're going to see leagues and franchises go away, at the margins. Those leagues and teams that are not well capitalized, because you need to have a reserve to get through this period where revenues are down so greatly. But the major leagues that we're also familiar with, they're not going away. So I think as soon as the worst of the pandemic is over, you're going to see the major professional leagues rebound quite quickly.
So also, you come from New Jersey, you went to college in Pennsylvania, and then now you've been in Maryland for a while, and also in the DMV region doing a lot of different things. What would you say, do you have any particularly favorite sports teams, or do you just kind of, as a sports fan in general?
That's an interesting question, Shane. And I think this, that, when you're a journalist covering a sport or a team, you're working hard to maintain kind of subjectivity and distance from that team. And, I've kind of reached a stage in my life with sports where I don't really have favorite teams. In the 80s, I was covering the Baltimore Orioles. I was the beat reporter covering the Baltimore Orioles. And, when you're covering a team, 8 or 9 months a year, and you're that close to the players and what's going on, you get a respect for what they do, but you're no longer a fan. You view what athletes do in a slightly different way. So this is kind of a roundabout way of saying that I enjoy watching sports, but I find that I don't have a rooting interest the way a typical fan would.
So with that said, you were talking about working with different players on the Orioles and speaking with players, which is obviously something a journalist does. Are there any players who have been particularly cool people to be able to speak with and talk to and make a relationship with?
Yeah, I've had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with some of the highest profile athletes, in the 80s and 90s in particular, but beyond that as well. When I was covering the Orioles, Cal Ripken was in his prime. Spent a lot of time with him, and he's a very impressive guy. Amazing work ethic, as we all know. Eddie Murray, Hall of Famer, and very talented athlete. Pretty shy with regard to the media, but interesting person to observe. I covered golf for probably 10 or 15 years. Jack Nicklaus, fascinating. I mean, I was talking to a friend about this the other day. It's rare that the best player in the sport is also the best interview in the sport. And for a long time, Jack Nicklaus was both. Arnold Palmer, Tom Watson. Yeah, those are some of the names that come to mind.
Dr. Hyman, appreciate you taking the time to come on to the show today.
Shane, thanks very much for the invitation. Look forward to seeing you in class.
Of course. Hopefully at some point when it all gets back to somewhat more of a normal.
That's great.
Thank you for tuning into this edition of The Shane Show. See you next time. Catch you on the flip side.